Good evening, and thank you all for coming. Welcome to Science on the Campaign Trail 2000. This session is organized by the AGU Committee on Public Affairs, or COPA. AGU is a membership organization, and its strengths in public affairs derives from its broad membership found across the country. AGU's small public affairs office is not meant to serve as a lobby on scientific issues. Instead, its mission and COPA's is facilitation. We try to help AGU members understand how scientific research affects policy and help them to learn how to bring their expertise to the policy process. And this session is offered in that spirit. We're bringing people whose primary work is policy and asking them to explain how scientists can participate. And now I'd like to ask Lou Lanzarote, the chair of COPA, to introduce the first speaker.
Thank you very much, Maggie. It certainly is welcome to see all of you here this evening on behalf of COPA. I want to thank you also. I also want to thank in public Maggie Collins for the tremendous effort that she put into organizing this session here this evening. It's been a lot of work. She's made innumerable, some large number of phone calls and email messages to try to put this together, and she exemplifies the best of the volunteerism in the AGU. As Maggie said, COPA, the AGU, the Committee on Public Affairs, tries to make aware of all the membership of the important policy issues in public affairs, not just on the national level, which we're addressing here tonight, but on your local and state levels as well. And we have articles in EOS periodically that address those kinds of issues. In fact, one of the former speakers of the House of Representatives, Tip O'Neill, authored a small book several years before he died. It's entitled All Politics is Local. It's a very charming little volume with a lot of anecdotes, some from the Democratic perspective, but nevertheless a lot of little anecdotes that are very nice. And I would recommend it to many of you who are interested in public affairs. Well, it certainly does give us a tremendous amount of pleasure to invite our keynote speaker here this evening for this session. Newt Gingrich has a PhD in history from Tulane University and brings a scholarly approach to politics and to the academic and educational environment in Washington and in the state of Georgia. He represented the 6th Congressional District in Georgia for 20 years in Congress, the last 4 of which was as Speaker of the House of Representatives. During his years in Congress, as well as his years as Speaker, and since he stepped down as being Speaker, he has spoken out on the importance of science and engineering and technology to the long-term importance in the United States of these activities. And he's here tonight to address these for us, to address to us how the political candidates use and or misuse science in their campaigns, and to illustrate how scientists can use the political process to bring good science to the campaigns and enhance the awareness in the political process of the importance of science. I welcome you here on behalf of the American Geophysical Union, Speaker Gingrich.
Thank you, Lou, and thank you, Maggie, and I thank all of you for coming tonight. I think if I have any one theme I want to talk about, it is the notion of the scientist as citizen. And I came to this particular event because I really want to encourage each of you to be actively involved in your community and in the larger community in trying to communicate both the nature of the scientific endeavor and the importance of that endeavor and the whole concept of why we as a country should be more deeply involved. It is, I think, in some ways the most important challenge of the next 10 years, to get across the degree to which our world is going to be shaped by science and to get across the centrality of the scientific process. I mean, if you think about it, there is nothing in the current political debate which in a serious way addresses the scale of the challenge we face in the next 20 or 30 years in terms of scientific knowledge. And I don't say this as a comment on the current politicians, except to the degree that it is very hard for the political process to describe something which hasn't first been described to it. This is in a sense, I think, what C.P. Snow was trying to say in the 1959 Reith lecture on the two cultures, when he basically argued that those who understand science are less and less capable of explaining it to those who don't understand it. So that the people who can communicate almost certainly don't know any science, and the people who know science almost certainly can't communicate. So if you see somebody in a talk show, you know they almost certainly don't know anything, or they wouldn't be able. Now, this is a very serious challenge. And I came tonight, I've spent the last year and a half out of public office, spending a lot of time studying. I've been at Georgia Tech. I called and asked if I could come over and be a student for a while, and they've been very generous to me in allowing me to come and learn things. And I go to the Center for Disease Control. I'm at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, so I get to go out to Silicon Valley and out to the Ames laboratories of NASA. And I'm at the American Enterprise Institute here in town looking at health and healthcare. And I recently was very fortunate to go up to MIT and spend an afternoon talking with people who are working on nanoscience. And it's been fascinating. In fact, it's been such a positive, such an opening up kind of experience that late last summer I began to realize I was missing some of the pain and the frustration that had come from my experiences in politics. And so in August of last year, I took up golf as a way of reasserting. And, when I was speaker, I had a schedule that was filled in every 5 minutes. I had staff in every meeting taking notes. I had the Capitol Police making sure that I got from place to place. I was recently reminded of the scale of change in my life. I was busy typing on the internet, and I got an instant message from Water Weasel. Water Weasel is my 6th grade niece, and it's spelled W-E-Z-E-L. And she asked how I was doing, and being a good, dutiful uncle, I responded, and we chatted back and forth for about 5 minutes. And then she said, "My girlfriend's arrived, I have to go by." And I realized I'd gone from being Speaker of the House and Man of the Year to being filler in the life of a 6th grader. So I come here with some trepidation as a non-scientist. I'm a historian by background. But I want to share with you sort of the core notion that science is central to understanding our future. And that the great endeavor you are part of, if you look at the list of topics being discussed at this conference, the totality of their effect will be amazing. Now, let me rephrase O'Neill. Speaker O'Neill, who was begrudgingly one of my mentors, not that he ever intended to have a Republican Speaker of the House, but we would occasionally chat about the virtues of leadership in the House and the degree to which large people with heads full of hair do it better than small, weak people who don't know what they're doing. And O'Neill almost had it right, but I wanted to start with, I think it's a very important lesson about the nature of politics, just as there are lessons you have to learn about the nature of science. In fact, all politics is not local. All politics is personal. If it's about you, if it's about your family, if it's about your neighborhood, then you really care a lot. I mean, when did the campuses really get worried about Vietnam? The morning after they extended the draft to college students. It was a universal realization the following morning. I mean, it wasn't local, it was personal. One of the points I make to every audience I talk to is if you're a baby boomer, the odds are 1 in 3 that you will get Alzheimer's if you live into your 80s. On the other hand, if you insist now on the appropriate level of investment in basic research, the odds are at least even money that won't happen. That's the scale of change we're living through. But if you're a baby boomer, if you're currently in your 30s to mid-50s, the time to insist on that investment is now. Because it's going to take us 20 years to make the breakthroughs, to thoroughly understand, to eliminate that threat. Now that may sound like a wild proposal, but imagine the 1940s when the President of the United States was in a wheelchair because of polio, trying to explain that it was conceivable within a generation, not that we'd invent a better iron lung, an aluminum lung, if you will, but that we would in fact discover a vaccine that would eliminate the danger for every American. And so I'm here because I think that there is no question in American life today more important than understanding the centrality of the scientific endeavor, understanding its implications, and understanding what it will take of our country to be successful at it for the next 30 years. I serve on a national strategic study group that reports to the Secretary of Defense on looking at the year 2025. We deliberately picked a year far enough out that it was beyond all of the rice bowls of the Pentagon, so nobody would understand how to explain what we weren't allowed to think about. And it was very important because it's very hard in this city to think much beyond the next budget cycle. My conclusion is that there are 4 great threats to the United States in national survival, only one of which is traditional defense. There's a genuine threat of a weapon of mass destruction going off in the United States, either by a terrorist or a rogue state or miscalculation. That's a very real threat, and all of us underestimate how horrible the consequences of that would be. That's the one traditional military threat. The other 3 threats all involve science. The first is that we will fail to invest in the scientific basic research we need, and within a generation, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, we'll fall behind. The second is that we'll fail to thoroughly, decisively overhaul our approach to science education, in which case we will inevitably fall behind because there will come a tipping point within the next 15 years where it will become easier for people to stay home or go home after their graduate education than to live in the U.S., and we will not be able to import the level of quality we need. The third is that we have to become a universally wired society with universal literacy, or we will in fact rapidly become 2 dramatically different countries. Now those 3, in my mind, as an American, as a historian, are greater threats to the survival of the United States than Russia, China, North Korea, Iraq, Iran, or any conceivable short-term combination of opponents. We are the preeminent country in the world today, but we could, within 20 years, cease to be preeminent. Let me explain why. We're currently going through a revolution all of you understand. We talk about it in the newspapers, and words which, by the way, would have been hard to explain 15 years ago. Can you imagine internet? Can you imagine mouse in the non-mammal sense? I mean, think about how many people you know personally who have in fact acquired a language because it became ubiquitous. Windows, and there are all sorts of things people do. Email. These things were not obvious 20 years ago. And I first went to look at computers in 1965 at Georgia Tech, and I can assure you that while there were patterns, certainly Licklider's Libraries of the Future began to give this impression by the mid-60s, nobody had invented this language. Nobody had thought these things through, and the national press couldn't have written about it. But now we can talk about e-commerce on a routine basis. People can talk about being on the net. People can talk about writing emails. And we all understand it in some general sense. I mean, I would say at least 40% of the country has some general knowledge, which is an astonishing penetration for cultural attitudes in a 20-year period. That all comes out of 2 revolutions, computers and communications. I was with the head of the microelectronics department at Georgia Tech, and he said there's a very simple way to understand the scale of change. The first computer built with transistors was built in 1955. It was called Tradic. It had 800 transistors. A Pentium 2 chip. How many of you have a Pentium 2 in your current PC? Oh, about halfway. How many of you have a Pentium 3 or beyond? Okay, so a number of you are already way past this. A Pentium 2 chip has 7.5 million transistors. This year, they believe they'll build they believe will build an experimental chip with about 1 billion transistors. And their projection was that by 2017, we'd have a chip with 1 trillion transistors. Now, what makes that fascinating is, first of all, if you were to draw a chart and go 800, 7.5 million, 1 billion, 1 trillion, it would be all, you couldn't do it. I mean, you couldn't manage in a room this size to show from 800 to 7.5 million to 1 trillion on the wall. It's too big a change. Second, that understates the scale of change. When you multiply it against bandwidth, against a whole range of other things that are happening, it's clear, the way I describe it, because I'm a historian, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a physicist, so the truth is I don't know in detail what that means. But I know it's big. And it's very important sometimes as a society to distinguish big from not big. So I describe as the lion-chipmunk problem. You know, lions can't afford to hunt chipmunks because even if they catch them, they starve to death. I mean, lions have to hunt zebras or antelope, things large enough that catching them is worthwhile. Well, the scale of change, which we don't know how to talk about, is a topic worth discussing. 90% of what passes for political talk on television is not worth discussing. We could have done with 5% of Elion and 40% of science and 50% of other serious topics. We'd have been a healthier society. And so it's a core challenge. So let's carry it then. Let's look at that in this context. What are some, antelope-sized topics? And here is why I think the scale of change is so important. If you imagine an S-curve of technology in which you have computers and communication rising rapidly, by the numbers I just gave you, my guess is we're about a fifth of the way up that chart. That is, there are 4 times as many changes in computing and communications coming as we've had since 1960. Now, most audiences, when they start thinking about that, that is big, and I think it is fairly big. But here's what makes it bigger. There is a second parallel wave of change coming, captured, I think, brilliantly at the Ames Laboratory of NASA by a mission statement, which is a simple triangle. They say on one side is biology, on the second side is nanoscience, and on the third side is information, by which they mean supercomputing and above. And their job is to bring those 3 together. Now, my guess as a historian is that those 3, when combined, and they're being combined every day right now, represent, and I mean this literally, not hyperbole, a larger change than the entire 20th century, for a very practical reason. If you can actually become proficient at working at the nano level, between basically 1 atom and about 400 atoms, if we as a species, if we learn how to truly use systems, tools, and methods at that level, you have changed every aspect of life. You change computing, and there's some estimates that a quantum computing system that used electrons as transistors would be approximately a 1 billion-fold increase in speed and memory. You change biology, because in fact that's the primary place of nanoactivity. Every protein, in effect, is simply a nanoactivity. And if you start learning how to, for example, invent or grow a molecule that hates cancer, so what you drink with your orange juice in the morning is something which has an instinct for cancer, but which doesn't cause any collateral damage because it passes through the cell membrane because it's molecular size. You've changed all sorts of patterns. If in fact you can develop, one of the things you carried around for a while, said it doesn't, when you see it, it doesn't mean much, but I've carried some carbon nanotubes around. And carbon nanotubes basically are, think of a straw that is 1 atom thick. Obviously, the ones I carried had lots and lots of layers, or you couldn't have seen them. But imagine a straw 1 atom thick, 7 or 9 atoms around, designed in such a way that it is 100 times as strong as steel and weighs 1/6 as much. Now apply that, for example, to automobiles to reduce pollution and to reduce gas mileage. Apply it to building the right kind of fuel tank so that you can now have a hydrogen fuel cell without having to liquefy the hydrogen or cool the hydrogen. And it's safe because each nanotube serves as its own protector of that particular part of the hydrogen. Imagine you can build now rocket ships or robotics for space that weigh that kind of weight with that kind of strength. And the reason I carried the tubes around for a while is to say to people, these are already being grown in a lot of places in the U.S. We don't know how to do it well yet. We can't ramp up to manufacturing. But we've passed the point at which it's a scientific issue. It's now an issue of engineering and technology. There are other scientific issues. Now, let me carry you a step further. And this is sort of my summary experience, particularly after working with NSF and with the American Museum of Natural History. Now, I want to pose it as a question, because most of you in this room are scientists. How many of you would say that in the field you know well, there have been major changes in core understandings since you were in college? Raise your hand. How many of you would say that in significant areas, about half the hands have gone up? I mean, I remember I was entering college when plate tectonics was stupid and leaving college when it was the state of the art. Now, plate tectonics, I mean, actually my background in part have been studying paleontology as an amateur in high school. And so for paleontologists, it was never a great shock because, in fact, the fossil beds imply that you have planets that were floating. But for a lot of geologists, plate tectonics was a huge breakthrough because it changed our whole underlying pattern. And in fact, without the International Geophysical Year, we might still not have finished that argument. So if you take a whole range of things, and whether you're talking about DNA or you're talking about our basic understanding of quantum mechanics, or you're talking about the way in which we now think about chaos theory, or you're thinking about a whole range of things in which we now think about biology differently, my guess is if you actually went back and looked at your high school textbooks, you would be startled how many of them would not in fact be current in their understanding of the world. And it's not just we've added a few more layers. In many areas, we've had profound changes in how we think about things. I noticed this spring, the Washington Post gave us the happy moment of two articles about weather side by side. One was an article that suggested that we had discovered in the last 3 years patterns in the Pacific which changed weather from China through the Sahara, and we didn't understand them very well. The other said that a snowstorm had occurred causing an enormous traffic jam because it arrived 8 hours earlier than predicted and nobody was ready for it. And it occurred to me, I wrote a letter to the President and the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader suggesting that if we currently have a state of knowledge in which we cannot tell when the snow's coming in the national capital and the day it's arriving, and we have systems as large as an entire ocean pattern in the Pacific which affects over half the planet's surface, that maybe as part of our thinking about the Kyoto Agreement on global warming, we should actually have a research project in which we would ask NOAA and the National Science Foundation and NASA and others to create a 10-year project parallel to the International Geophysical Year to actually invest a couple of $1 billion while we're beginning to talk about spending trillions of dollars. Because the truth is we now have the scale of instrumentation which would allow us, if we had a serious worldwide project, we could know an extraordinary amount within a decade. But that requires thinking about a worldwide instrumentation. It requires thinking about the scale of research involved. It requires dedicating the level of computation necessary. And that's simply beyond current thinking. And so I want to make a series of propositions to you. Proposition number one, science is the engine which drives the economy. It drives better health. It drives national security. Without a powerful scientific engine, we are going to see our economy peak out and flatten out, just as Britain did in the 1870s. This is not a new phenomenon. The British could not make the transition from the science and technology of the first two industrial revolutions to the third industrial revolution. They fell behind Germany and the United States because they literally couldn't bring their culture to shift. Second, I want to suggest to all of you that when you back up and look at science writ large, the most startling thing about it is the scale of change currently underway almost across the board. That's partly a function of instrumentation. We can now see further out into space and further down into the origins of matter than ever before, and so we're just learning a lot. And a lot of what we're learning is not additive. It's not, oh, gee, that's sort of what we thought, but here we have 10% better vision. In a lot of places, it is profoundly changing how we think about things, and in some cases, it is forcing us to turn on its head what we thought was true. Again, as somebody who likes paleontology, if you just go back to Huxley's suggestion that dinosaurs and birds were related, to the intervening 90 years of assuming dinosaurs were slow and reptiles, cold-blooded, to the current belief that probably birds are dinosaurs. These are fairly big changes. I mean, just look at the American Museum's T-Rex, which had its tail down because as a reptile it didn't generate enough energy to keep its tail up, to the new model that they did, which has it in a totally different pose, looking a lot more scary. I mean, you think about a species as intelligent as a parrot, weighing 20 tons and wanting to eat you. And you have a whole different vision than thinking about a large alligator. And so all of that's happened in the last 25 years. And you can go into almost every zone and you discover these kind of breakthroughs are underway. And I don't think the scientific community, A, knows how to aggregate across its own boundaries, and B, knows how to say to everybody else on the planet, we're not about certainty. We're about discovery. We're not about knowing, we're about learning. We're not about fact, we're about possible future fact. which is a totally different way of thinking. So then my second point is, we're in the middle, or the early stages, of an enormous scientific revolution. And we had better be prepared to commit the resources to get there. My third point is, the United States government is a totally legitimate vehicle to engage in that. I'm often asked, since I'm a conservative, how can I be for the government making these big investments? And I try to start out by suggesting that people like Jefferson, Franklin, and Washington, each of whom in their own way were engaged in scientific research. Washington was a breeder, for example. He understood genetic manipulation and was engaged in his generation's version of it with Spanish sheep and was growing a better breed. Jefferson, of course, was a student of science, and Franklin was a genuine scientist, one of the leading scientists of his generation. They got it. They thought the government had clear roles to play. And I suggest to people, if you go back and look at the Lewis and Clark expedition, for the size of that government, the boldness of that decision, the degree to which it was committed to learning about research. You look at the entire history of the U.S. Geological Survey, for example. We have a deep tradition of involvement. I go out to Silicon Valley and I have libertarians who are now dramatically wealthy explaining that government doesn't matter. My suggestion is simple. Take away the U.S. Army contract for ENIAC at the University of Pennsylvania, the first working computer. Take away all of the DARPA funding for all the various breakthroughs. Take away the DARPA funding for the internet. Take away the Defense Department contracts for things like chip manufacturing. And show me how rich these guys would be. Many of them would be pumping gas, wondering why they weren't doing better. Because the fact is, none of the money made in Silicon Valley would have been made without U.S. government basic research. And so when I see libertarians, I just say what they're saying basically is, either A, they're glad they made it and they don't care about their kids, or B, they need to think about who does the basic research, as opposed to where I'm very strongly committed. My friend and former colleague Bob Walker here and I have fought often against the government being involved in the implementation in the marketplace, because we think government's frankly bad at implementing in the marketplace. But we think it is the primary funder, particularly in peer-reviewed circumstances or with carefully defined large projects, in both of which I think we need. Let me carry a step further. If, in fact, we're in the middle of a scientific revolution, if it is central to where we're going, if, in fact, the government has a very legitimate role, how should we think about this? Now, I strongly favor doubling the NIH budget, but in retrospect, I wish I had insisted on doubling the budgets across the board, because it sent exactly the wrong signal. While NIH is important, the National Science Foundation is probably more important. The fact is that what we needed was an aggressive commitment to broad-based basic research, and even to my friends who care directly about health research, I would suggest to them the great breakthroughs in instrumentation are almost all driven by physics, chemistry, and mathematics, and almost all of them come out of NSF rather than coming out of NIH. And so you need, in fact, a broad-based commitment, but I want to suggest a new way of thinking about it. All of us have, in a sense, ridden Vannevar Bush's vision of the future for over a generation. His coming out of the Second World War and suggesting a pattern for government research was really the preeminent stage to the modern big science that we've enjoyed so much from in terms of prosperity. I don't think we just need Vannevar Bush plus 12% a year. I think we need a totally different approach, and I have a very specific suggestion, which I made recently at an American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting. I believe either the AAAS or the National Academy of Sciences or a specially appointed scientific community panel or something, somewhere somebody needs to develop what I want to call an opportunity-based budget. Don't tell me how much we're currently spending, assume that's a benchmark, and tell me how much we ought to fight for next year. What we ought to ask of the scientific community is, how much could you invest intelligently to expand knowledge based on what you're now learning, and how much do you need in next generation instrumentation and computation in order to implement those opportunities? Now, for example, Rita Caldwell at the National Science Foundation believes without any question that she could move from $4.5 billion to $11 billion this year and not fund anything except national class research. And that's without designing any large long-term projects like mapping the planet in terms of climate. That's just implementing current peer-reviewed applications that they're not going to fund because they don't have the money. I would suggest we're at a different stage there. What we ought to say is, here is the state of our current knowledge. Here are the frontiers we stand on the edge of. And here's what resources and what projects it would take to execute that. And we should recognize that between remote sensing, permanent capacity to calibrate information at levels that we'd never imagined before, extraordinary abilities to reach down into the nano world and below, and a remarkable ability to reach out into space in terms of astrophysics, that we really have opportunities that make any previous period pale in comparison. And yet we don't know how to explain it, we don't know how to make it vivid, and we don't know how to price it. But I believe the American people would be sold on it by a couple of simple standards. First of all, if you look at the possibilities inherent in nanoscience, it is conceivable that we're going to be able to basically eliminate the toxic side of what we worry about with the environment by moving into a totally different series of production capabilities that have totally different side effects. If you go, for example, to hydrogen fuel cells, you change totally both our expectations about global warming and all sorts of air pollution factors. You also change the relative importance of the Middle East in ways that would lead to far fewer news reports from there. Because, in fact, hydrogen is virtually, for all practical purposes, it's universal. When you go down the list and you look at other capabilities we've got, if we could find a cure for diabetes, I'm on the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation board, they believe they're within $2 billion of research in being able to make that breakthrough. A cure in the sense of a vaccine or some device which blocks the effect, not just a palliative. The largest single cost driver of Medicare is diabetes. Every seventh dollar is spent on heart disease, kidney disease, blindness, or loss of feet to amputation based on diabetes. Now, if you can invest $2 billion to save 1/7 of Medicare, plus the human suffering, the human loss of sight, the human loss of feet, the human heart disease, the human kidney disease, that's an investment every American would buy. And I think we really need a dialogue at the national level that says, here's how far we have to go. So I think we should have an opportunity-based science budget. But there's a stage beyond that. We have to profoundly overhaul our approaches in math and science education. And I want to suggest this at two very different levels. One is that we need to go back to science as discovery, as learning. We need to find a way to get young people engaged with scientists, not with science teachers. There's a total difference. People who go through schools of education, who learn about facts, no matter how passionate they are, no matter how much they care, it is not the same as being in touch with somebody who is every day engaged in the great pursuit of knowledge. Now, we have the distance learning capability. We have the capability to literally have kids involved. There was one NASA scientist at Ames who has over 10,000 students now involved in a program involving single-cell organisms all across Northern California. That's part of the future. To recreate the passion Darwin first felt as an amateur beetle collector. It's important to remember, much of the 19th century, people were genuinely passionate because they were doing it. I asked recently, what percent do we know of the species that are single-cell? And I was told that the place we most understand is waste sludge, and we know probably 15% of the species. I actually mentioned this to Dr. Caldwell, and she said since that was her field, she was going to disagree vehemently. She thought we'd be lucky if we knew 3% of the species. Now that means when you get down to single-cell organisms, that virtually every elementary school in America could name 20 species in the next decade. They could be involved at the cutting edge of learning things about the real world in ways that were genuinely involved. And by using the internet, you can have people directly engaged. And there are a dozen other areas like that, including large parts of astrophysics, where we're now getting the instrumentation to find a lot more stars than we're going to study and name in a generation. But what I'm suggesting is two phases. Phase one, recreate the idea of the citizen as scientist. I want to talk in a minute about the scientist as citizen. But recreate the idea of the citizen as engaged in the scientific pursuit at pre-professional levels, but genuinely engaged. Number two, and here I'm in the Eisenhower tradition of the Republican Party and the Eisenhower tradition of national defense. Whatever we have to do to shift enough kids in the 7th, 8th, and 9th grades, we should do it. If that means offering cash incentives, we should seriously do it. If we don't have enough people who can do calculus in high school and enough people who can do calculus in the first year of college, we are, as a country, literally incapable of competing in the 21st century. And we need to profoundly rethink it, not go through the 23rd Study Commission that says, given a state curriculum, a tenured faculty, a bureaucratic model, a total absence of any incentives, what is the most we can do next year to improve our grades? But we ought to say the opposite. We need X% to be good at math and X% to be good at science, and we need to do whatever it takes to get them there, because it is a national survival issue for this country not to be ignorant at the very moment we're giving the planet a chance to learn about science the way we never have before. And if you look at the numbers, it is very frightening how relatively few Americans are being prepared to truly participate in what will be the greatest scientific century up to this point in the history of the human race. Lastly, in terms of real change, I believe unequivocally that we should adopt as a policy that we are for the universal extension of the computer to every person in America, that it is our goal to put every family on the internet. And I testified in 1995 when I was Speaker. I went to the Ways and Means Committee and said, we ought to give every 4-year-old a computer that teaches them how to read and write, and once they master reading and writing, we ought to put them on the internet. I believe, we did it with the telephone. We made a decision at the turn of the century that the telephone would be universally available. We cross-subsidized to get it done. The city of LaGrange, Georgia is the first one I know of which has decided they're going to get a computer into every household in LaGrange. But unless we decide to send a signal to the poorest child in America, you're going to be part of the information age. We are kidding ourselves if we think they can watch television, which is, by the way, virtually universal. So they can sit at home, watch color television, see all the .com commercials, show up at school, realize all the kids in the school except them have a computer, be given paper and pencil and told, no, you better go to work so you have a great future. And I think we have to take a very simple, straightforward goal. Within the next 5 to 6 years, we should have a model which allows us to give every child a PC they take home. The first PC ought to come at a very early age. By the way, that dramatically increases adult learning because parents who can't read will more often read from their child's computer than they will by going to an adult literacy program, which they find embarrassing. We have data from places like El Paso that shows that. Dramatic impact when kids take PCs home. Now, what's your job? I came to talk about the scientist as a citizen because I don't believe anything I just said can happen without the scientific community. If you don't believe the coming scientific revolution is big enough that people ought to pay attention, why should anybody around you believe it? If you're not prepared to take the time to learn to say in common, everyday language, here's what it means and here's why it's important, why should you think politicians and reporters are going to learn it? If you don't think it's important to you to be a citizen, why do you think anybody else is going to be a citizen? And my message to scientists is simple. You understand in a narrow, focused way an enormous amount about something. That's how you got your degree. That's how you got your research grants, right? And isn't this basically the rules? I used to be the coordinator of environmental studies at West Georgia College, and I had physicists and chemists and others, biologists, all working with me. And as we would talk about the various games one plays in order to rise in various professions. So you know a lot about something. But most of you then say, oh, but that citizenship stuff, that's not my job. See, what I'm doing over here is really important. Well, I just want to suggest to you, there can't be anything more important in an age of change than the kind of citizenship we're describing. I have a little paper. I was closed with a paper. We have a website called Newt.org. We have a paper there on the age of transitions, which I'd love for you to take a look at and comment on, because it was my first effort to say, look, this is not going to stabilize in our lifetime. You're going to go through one transition, to go through another transition, to go through another transition, and we desperately need to convince the scientific community that in addition to knowing about science, you have some obligation to be a good enough citizen to explain a little bit of it. And whether you explain that by visiting your congressman and your legislator and your county commissioner and your school board, or you do it by going to a town hall meeting and making a statement, or you're doing it by actually going to a local civic group and making a speech, or writing a letter to the editor, it is desperately important that those who know share with those who don't, so we can make the right decisions. And I think literally the future of the human race is in part involved Because if we can make fast enough breakthroughs in scientific knowledge in the next 30 years, I think we can get to a planet that is virtually safe, prosperous, and free across the whole planet. If we can't, I think the tensions of having those who are without hope living next to those who are without any knowledge of hopelessness leads inevitably to enormous levels of violence. And so I think that literally we have a challenge to push through as hard and fast as we can to create the kind of understanding and the kind of knowledge that liberates the entire human race. I'd be glad, I think I have some time left to take questions. I'll be glad to toss it wide open. Yes, sir.
With your notion of science as a citizen, I'd like to point out that last week I was the chairman and an invited speaker at the 8th International Conference on Cold Fusion, which is actually a very viable area of research that has not been heard about in this country. And there's tremendous progress. Now, this gets down to an interesting point about getting outside box. This is an area that was very much blacklisted, and actually it gets down to your business about hydrogen fuel cells, and actually it's very much contested. I think that it is very important what you said about science speaking out for what will count, and that's part of the reason that I make this comment. The other interesting point, though, that I think is very worthwhile that I don't think you got into is the business about young people, having good teachers, bringing young people into science, but also the role of teachers and whether the government can take a proactive view, a proactive stance in this process, and what role society such as AGU might have in it.
Well, I think you did a pretty good job of covering a lot of different topics. Let me say, first of all, I don't know whether cold fusion exists or doesn't exist yet, but it is not abnormal for very large breakthroughs to be controversial and to be a running fight. I mean, science is not about people meekly getting together in a back room to reach some judgment without passion. And I think there are a lot of examples in the history of science where people either thought they were right and turned out to be wrong, or were accused of being wrong and turned out to be right. And you often, and sometimes they were told to be right, and then later on found out they were not totally right. Yeah. So, okay. Second, I believe government has a central necessity to find a way to get young people in touch with science and math. And whether they do it through incentives, or they do it through programs of distance learning that ties them to the right groups, whether we can do it by relaunching the notion of active involvement in science, which I think is a very important part of this. My only point would be none of those are minor modifications of the current structure of education. These are all major changes in how we currently go about the process of having a state curriculum tell you what page to be on in a textbook which is partially wrong and I think partially dulls the very interest in science. There's a reason that somewhere around 6th, 7th, and 8th grade we have a dramatic drop-off in the number of young people who are interested in the process of learning about the world. Yes, sir.
One of the major subjects of concern is age. How can science do something to help in this terrifically damaging area?
Well, I think science has helped a fair amount in the developed world with AIDS from the standpoint, first, that there was a much earlier recognition that it was an epidemic than might otherwise have occurred. Second, that a great deal of work was done through public health services and the Center for Disease Control and the Public Health Service. And the local public health services deserve some credit. If you look at the rate at which AIDS has spread in the developed world, it declined dramatically as an immediate epidemiological threat as people began to get messages and as we worked at it. Third, I think there are, in fact, some palliatives, no cure yet and no vaccine, but people certainly live longer and live healthier today with HIV than you would have predicted in 1984 or 85. And in that sense, it's having an effect. I think where we've got to have an entirely different strategy is when you are dealing with areas that are very poor. And whether this means that the government ought to be buying the patents in order to distribute these drugs at the cost of production, or whether it means we ought to find some massive tax credit, or how we do it. But we need a totally new strategy, both for sub-Saharan Africa and for the parts of Asia that are going to become hit very, very hard. And that, again, that's not just a slight marginal change. We need to back up totally, recognize the size of this crisis. Sub-Saharan Africa is the place that's going to be the hardest hit, but I think there's real evidence now in India and in China that this could take off in a way which is not a pandemic, but it's very, very dangerous. And I think it's something we need to deal with, and we need to deal with much more creatively than we have. Yes?
You spoke about us being on the frontier of a lot of different areas of science and encourage us to go get them. Are there any frontiers that are either too risky to pursue or not worth pursuing or that are ethically problems?
Well, I think there are clearly frontiers that you want to be very careful about. And I think that Bill Joy, who's the Sun Microsystems writer, research director, who recently wrote and warned us about the danger of self-replicating, self-learning systems that would threaten the survival of the human race. I think there's some limited danger of something like that happening, but I thought he was profoundly wrong on two counts. The first was that the possession of knowledge has always been dangerous. I mean, Prometheus is chained to a rock, and a vulture comes every day to eat out his liver because he discovered fire. This is a basic Greek mythology that said, when you take knowledge, you take pain with it. You know, it's Icarus flying too close to the sun and the wax melting and then falling from the sky because, again, hubris led him to overuse his knowledge. It is Adam and Eve who, remember, take the apple, which is from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The apple wasn't evil. The apple was power. God drove them out because they had achieved the power, and therefore they lost mortality or immortality and became mortal. So first, yes, any new knowledge, I mean, biotechnology is dangerous. If you don't think so, look at good studies on what the impact of a really good, if you could somehow produce an airborne epidemic in this population with our current vulnerabilities, go back and look what happened to North American Indians when they were hit by European diseases. And there were villages that had 4% survival rates. So yes, biotechnology could be really dangerous. Yes, nuclear power can be very dangerous. Yes, almost any knowledge, the right kind of police state with our current computer power and remote sensing will be a much more frightening place than Nazi Germany. So knowledge is dangerous. I agree with that, but I also think it's a truism, and so you got to divide things. But there's a second point. If you're entering a zone of knowledge that is really dangerous, there are good historic grounds for wanting a democracy to get there first. Can you imagine in 1946, where Stalin or Mao Zedong had a monopoly of nuclear weapons? This would be a very different planet. And so I would argue that you want to make sure that, in fact, it is American scientists and other democracies who have the resources and the capabilities to understand dangerous technologies, precisely so, as we have done, by the way, with genetic engineering, we can begin to establish some ground rules. And I think there you saw genetic scientists begin to work on it long before the politicians, and it was genetic scientists who said, hey, this is really an area we better figure out what are the ethical rules of proceeding.
Marshall McNutt is our incoming president of the American Geophysical Union.
That's your theme on we get concerned about things when they touch us. I think many of us as parents, as university professors, and as scientists are concerned about the state of K-12 education in the U.S. And on one hand, I hear people arguing that our problem is that as voters, we're not investing enough in K-12 education. And on the other hand, I hear people argue that, no, we put lots of money in K-12 education, but the system seems to be failing our children, perhaps because it's too much one size fits all. What's your view on what it's going to take to fix K-12 education?
Well, that's almost an entire additional speech. Let me just give you a couple of observations. This is a country pulled forward by incentives. A standard question I used to ask 5 or 6 years ago. How many of you went over the speed limit in order to get to the airplane that brought you here? Raise your hand, be honest. How many of you went over the speed limit in order to get to the airport to get here? More and more hands up as you start thinking about it, right? All right, ask it differently. How many of you broke the posted number at least once in the last 2 weeks? More and more hand. Now we know who rides Metro. My point, though, it goes to the core of what's wrong with the current model of education. This is the least bureaucratic culture in history. We have a passion for not being controlled in petty ways. So over the last 40 years, with the best of intentions, we've designed state curricula, planning guides. We designed certification programs, accreditation. We have teachers who spend less and less time studying, less and less time passionate about learning, more and more time inside a bureaucracy. We tell our kids, most of whom do not have the kind of parental structure I had in the 1950s, where my parents were fairly adamant about the degree I'd pay attention. You know, I mean, when the basic attitude of your father, which nowadays, by the way, would probably be suable. I mean, you know, my stepfather's attitude was very simple. He was an infantry officer. I would study or die. He was frankly indifferent to which choice I made. I mean, I just had to. You know, nowadays we'd have him in court as for brutalizing me psychologically. You know, so I start with a couple of core beliefs, because I think when you're dealing with first of all, it's really important to understand the system is broken. There was an article, I think it's this morning's Washington Post, about the D.C. school system, that if you have any concern for the children of your national capital, you should have had a wound in your heart reading the article. I mean, they just had the 5th superintendent quit in 10 years. They have a system that is ungovernable. They have a group of petty local politicians on the school board who feather their own nest. They have a procurement system that doesn't work, a tenure system that doesn't work. They have a number of teachers who mean terribly well. I mean, there are teachers out there struggling against a rising tide of disaster. And they have children who deserve better. Kansas City just disaccredited its school, Kansas City, Missouri. These children are going to be told this fall, under compulsory attendance, you could go to a suburban school. You cannot go to any private school in your own neighborhood. But you could go to a suburban school, or you could go back into a building which we have now been told is so bad it's lost its certification. Now, how about that for a morale breaker? 12 systems in Pennsylvania were told the same thing this spring, including the capital, Harrisburg. Now, I just want to stop and say, as a baseline, this is a broken system. And I think there's some profound reasons. You live in a world where people have telephones and they have television. And on television, they have cable. And they watch the Titanic, and it's 2 hours and 10 minutes or so, and it costs $200 million. And then we turn to a textbook and a class moving at the pace of 30 people with discipline problems. And you wonder why there's this gap in focus. One of the places I consult is a little firm called Net Schools, and they have a PC you take home. And they report anecdotally that the attention deficit disorder children go from 10 minutes of paying attention to 90 minutes because they're in control. And now they're not bored. And by the way, you then let them read what they want to read. I mean, they want to read about race car driving? Let them read about race car driving. They're reading. But that's not what the topic is for this particular day on the state curriculum. So our attitude today is we don't care how bored you are. I have a niece who, in fact, is 2.5 years or 3 years ahead of her class in programming computers. She's an 8th grader. She's taking a course on programming that is 2 to 3 years behind where she currently is because it's an easy A. Now, how bored is she? How contemptuous is she of the current system? So I start with a very simple premise. You want to rethink it from the ground up? I mean totally. You want to ask yourself, why do we have an agricultural era schedule so people can be out to harvest? Why do we have an industrial era 50 minutes so people sit in a row looking at the foreman? None of you learn that way. Nobody learns that way anymore. Unless you're going to a very intense class for 3 days with a brilliant person where you're immersing yourself and then you leave to go back and learn on your own or learn with a mentor. And I'm not talking about putting people in rooms and locking them away with computers. Because every time you start to talk about changing things, people grotesquely exaggerate what you're saying. What I'm saying is we ought to start with the idea we want children to learn. We want to reward learning. We want to rethink it from the ground up. We want it to be individualized. We want it to be on a computer, which is 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, just like an ATM. All of you use an ATM. It doesn't exist till you want it. Then it's sitting there and it's your personal checking account. Some of you from 2,000 and 3,000 miles away are going to get cash by walking up to an anonymous machine, putting in a card, punching in a code. You can do it 24 hours a day. So we don't want to put the computer in the classroom. We want to put the classroom in the computer. And I'll say one last thing just to wrap this particular topic up. The concept of adolescence is a 19th century bourgeois effort to keep kids out of sweatshops. It is a disaster. You put 12, 13, 14, and 15-year-old boys in a group doing nothing with their leader being 14 or 15, you are begging for trouble. You allow MTV to become the primary definer, or VH1, of what kids ought to talk about. You know, Franklin left Boston at 13 and went to Philadelphia to go to work as an apprentice to his uncle. Carnegie went to work in his teens. Edison went to work in his teens. Why? Because they were young men. Romeo is 13, Juliet's 12 in the original play. This idea that you can take people who are past puberty, lock them away, pretend that they are neither children nor adults, allow them to be dominated by their peers, and not produce a mess. It's just crazy. And that's why I think the citizen scientist, the idea of the amateur scientist, is important. A lot of these kids who today are bored to death, if they were involved in the real pursuit of knowledge, if they had a chance through the internet to be playing with real adults, if twice a year they saw a real scientist and talked about their real work, they wouldn't be problems. They wouldn't have discipline difficulties. They wouldn't lack some purpose. They'd be engaged in life. But that's a very different model than Tuesday we're going to study Chapter 3, because that's what the state board says we have to do. And so that's the scale of change we need.
Mr. Speaker, you indicated you wanted to know when the time was.
Okay.
Time is about here.
All right. Well, let me just close with this thought, and I can't say this too strongly. If you go back and look at the human race prior to 1700, there's no place on the planet that isn't in danger of famine, isn't in danger of plague, isn't in danger of death in brutal and nasty ways. By 1800, in a handful of places, thanks to science applied through people like Watt and Newcomb, there began to be an industrial revolution which raised the standard of food, raised the standard of health, raised the standard of opportunity, and began to spread safety. We're on the edge of revolutions, I think, fully as great as Newton and Einstein. And I think on more fronts, more simultaneously. There will be more scientific knowledge in the next 20 years than the last 300. I think that's literally true. And that means we need people who understand science, talking as citizens, to help all of us understand this world we're creating. Thank you very, very much.